I'm Bert Gallen, and I spent 37 years in the BBC. Most of the time, in fact, was in the transmission group, but I also spent time in central personnel in Northern Ireland and the World Service. I got interested in engineering and in radio when I was doing my national service in the RAF. And what happened when I came out of the RAF is I started to study engineering and I went full time for a year. And then I didn't really have enough money to keep going full time. And so I went part time and combined that with a job in a factory that made equipment for telephone exchanges. And round about that time, the BBC advertised nationally for trainee engineers and technicians, and I applied. I honestly wasn't very hopeful, and there was quite a delay between my application and being called for an interview. But happily, I was, and I was offered a job.
What year was this, Bert?
This was 1958. I actually joined in September 1958.
So it's before the great sort of expansion that came from BBC Two.
Yes, but there was a huge expansion then in engineering, and probably they were probably quite desperate, in fact, for staff. I think they
Hmm.
were actually at the time, because there was a huge expansion of the transmitter network as a result of the expansion of the television service. And there was also expansion in regional broadcasting as well. So as a result of that, actually, yes, there was this massive recruitment and training program. We did an induction course in London, and then they sent us off to different bases. And I went to this transmitting station called Wufferton, which was on the Shropshire-Herefordshire border to the south of Ludlow. Beautiful, beautiful part of the country. The only snag, actually, was the engineer in charge, who had a terrible reputation. His name was L.F. Ivin, Ivin, and of course he was known as Ivin the Terrible. And he was a very, very difficult man. Particularly the older members of staff, he was
Yes.
very, very intolerant. But he was kinder to those of us who were newly joined, and I mean the training that he provided for us was absolutely first class. He involved us in everything, every single part of the station. We worked in the workshops, the diesel engine room. We worked out with the rigger mechanics in the huge aerial
Mm.
field in these shortwave transmitters. So the practical training was absolutely first rate. After we'd been there about 8 months, he called us in individually for an interview, and he asked us a lot of questions. And then he took us around the transmitting station, and he would point to a piece of equipment and say, "What does that do? What is that for?" This was really nerve-wracking.
Yes.
At the end of this interview, he said, "Right, I'm going to recommend that you go on to the training course at Wood Norton." If he'd have said no, then that would have been the end of it. I would have been dismissed
Yes.
because we were on probation. We were called probationary technical assistants. And then we went to Wood Norton on this 3-month course, and if you failed, you were out. If you passed, you carried
Mm.
on. But there was another year before you were established staff. So you were monitored through this second year, but there were no other exams. You were just monitored, and they just made sure they were happy with you. And then at the end of the 2 years, you were established. And at the same time, in fact, you had to join the pension fund. I know at the time I was a bit miffed because I'd had a salary increase and it was completely wiped out by the pension payments, which were about 7.5% then. It was very high. I can remember the administrative assistant saying to me, he was a man in his sort of mid 50s, and he said, "You will be surprised. This will go very quickly, and you'll be very grateful at the end of it." And that's
Yes.
absolutely true.
Now listen, Bert, you say you were out on the Shropshire border at this transmitter. So there were a group of people to look after a transmitter. Or was this usual that each transmitter had a group of people looking after it who were
Yes, that
engineers of all kinds? I mean, you had to look after generators,
yes,
presumably look after
yes.
the tower itself.
What happened with the shortwave transmitting stations is they were fully staffed. I mean, the equipment, a lot of the equipment that the BBC were using then was manually operated. I mean, it dated from the 1930s, and in the case of Wolferton, it was the early 1940s. It was actually American equipment which had been imported in 1942 when the station was built. There were 6 transmitters, and they were very flexible. You could change the frequencies, and you could connect them to different aerials out in the aerial field. And this change went on throughout the 24 hours as we were broadcasting to different countries and different parts of large countries like the Soviet Union, for example. So there was shift staffing of engineers who operated and maintained the transmitter equipment, and then they were supported by technicians in workshop technicians and aerial mechanics, people who looked after the aerials, and we had a small diesel maintenance team. But as young engineers, we actually did work with all of these different groups. So as I said before, in fact, I mean, the training was absolutely first class.
What about health and safety? Did you climb up the transmitter?
And the shortwave stations, the tallest ones, they were about 300 feet to 350 feet high. And the shortwave aerials were sort of strung between a pair of masts. And so it was necessary for people to climb up and down it to make sure everything was working. There were pulleys at the top, which the aerials were connected to. And it wasn't a requirement of the job when you joined that you had to climb masts, but there was a test carried out. What the BBC wanted to do was to identify people who would climb masts at a future date and could be trained for aerial work. And this test comprised of climbing up a mast to about 15 feet with an experienced rigger. And he would get to 15 feet and he would then say, now, look across there, look down, look to the side, look down again. This went on for a minute or so. And then he said, how do you feel? And I said to him, well, yes, I feel okay. That's all right. Then he said, you can climb. And apparently at 15 feet, you can tell whether somebody can climb or
Suffer
or
some
they
vertigo
can't.
or something like
So,
that. Yes, I
yes,
see.
yeah.
Right.
And the funny thing is, much later on, our son was in the Territorial Army, and he transferred to the Paras, and he loved this. But they had to go through a very rigorous set of tests, and he was doing wonderfully until he got to the last test, which was to climb up a pole. And he found that he suffered from vertigo, and that was the end of that, actually. So it's
Really?
strange. When we joined back in the 1950s, we were given a very slim booklet called Engineering Safety Regulations. There were a few pages in it, and at the end of it, there was a form, and it said, I have read and understood these safety regulations. I am responsible for my own safety the whole time I'm working for the BBC, and we had to sign it, and that was it. Now, during my career, health and safety became a huge growth industry, and this little booklet, by the time I had retired, was replaced by a shelf full of sort of old telephone directory size books along this whole shelf full of safety regulations. And I said to the man who was in charge of the BBC safety, I said, this is ludicrous. I kept my little engineering safety, and I told him, I said, this was simple, straightforward. Who can possibly read all of that lot and do a job at the same time? But no, that was astonishing change.
It's like terms and conditions on almost everything you
Yes.
click on. Yeah. You say you had to change frequencies and so on in order to transmit to different parts of the world.
Yes.
Presumably the aerial was strung between two thing, so it was actually radiating in a particular direction.
That's
Where
right. Yes.
where
Yes.
was this where was this transmitter aimed at?
There were a lot of transmissions. It was shared by the BBC and the Voice of America. The Voice of America had put in a lot of money in building Wooferton because of wanting to broadcast to the Soviet Union as it became, and also to the Middle East. And that was the sort of specialist area that Wooferton covered, Soviet Union and the Middle East. And also, in fact, I mean, there was a little bit sort of going down towards South America. And what would happen is a particular aerial would be suitable for transmission to a particular part of the world, and at day or night time as well. There were these sort of differences. And each of these aerials was connected back to the transmitter through a special tower arrangement. And you could select the aerial from the transmitter.
I see.
So
There
there
were
was this.
a set of aerials at different
That's
pointing in
right.
different
Yes.
directions. Yes,
Yes.
I
And there were six
understand.
transmitters
Yes,
that you could use actually. And these frequencies to get the best coverage, because the signal, it doesn't go direct like a domestic television or the radio signals. It actually fires up into the air and it bounces off something that they call the ionosphere back
yes.
down to ground again. So all that is very critical. The frequency you use, the angle you use to get the best coverage.
How did you know that you were actually being received at the other end?
The Well Service had a specialist sort of unit that monitored this and got feedback from different parts of the world. And of course, they had correspondence in lots of countries all around the world, and they would help as well. It did become quite sophisticated, even measuring what went on in the Soviet Union as the Cold War developed. And of course, what the Russians did is they would transmit from within the Soviet Union, from transmitters using the same frequencies that the BBC was using to actually jam the signals. So that the people in Bush House who used to decide which frequencies to use would always be working out how to change the frequency to overcome the jamming, as well as getting the signal into the best signal into a
Yes.
particular location.
How did you change frequencies? What was the
Well,
procedure?
the aerials, as I said, were a part of this, and then at the transmitter itself, there were huge copper coils at the output end of the transmitter, and they would determine what the frequency that you could use. So you had at the front of the transmitter, you had something called an oscillator, which selected the right frequency, and it would tune the whole transmitter, including these copper coils at the output of the transmitter. Now, when you change frequency, you had to change these copper coils. They were huge things, and they had to be changed physically. The rest of the frequency changes you could do on the transmitter with dials. That was fairly easy. You then had to get into the transmitter and lift out the coils that you had been using for the previous frequency and put in another set of coils. They were large. The big problem was if you had a very rapid frequency change, they were still very hot from the previous broadcast.
Yeah.
So you had to wear some rather hefty gloves. And then, of course, the aerial, the transmitter itself was connected to the appropriate aerials out in the aerial field. The transmission would start, and then you'd broadcast for however long it was. It could be half an hour, it could be for quite a longer than that, and then you would have to change frequency again. So you had staff 24 hours a day who were doing these changes. Of course, if there was a fault occurred, you had to pile in and find out what was wrong.
Now, were you communicating with Bush House when all this was
Yes,
going on?
yes. There's a control room at these shortwave transmitting stations, and they were in contact, in fact, with Bush House and also with the people on the individual transmitter out in the transmitter hall.
Presumably, they could find out by listening themselves to those frequencies, they could find out if you're being jammed, could they?
The monitoring service at Caversham could pick up jamming signals, so they could tell Bush House, in fact, that there was, and a lot of information came from the monitoring service about jamming. There was this battle went on about changing frequencies, trying to outdo whoever was doing the
Yeah.
jamming.
Right.
Some years later, when actually I was chief engineer World Service, the Soviet Union had collapsed. We were able to find out exactly where all their transmitters were that they used for jamming, and the people in the scheduled unit in Bush House were able to work out, in fact, how much it cost. And it was millions, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was millions of pounds they spent on jamming ours and the Voice of America services.
So the Voice of America was going out the same frequency, but presumably just at different times.
Or maybe different frequencies, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Now, how many shortwave transmitters were there in the country then?
Besides Wooferton, there were two transmitters on a site at Skelton in Cumbria, and there was another big site at Daventry, that's the original BBC shortwave station, and there was another station at Rampisham in Dorset, and then there were also stations that we had overseas. Yes.
I imagine they were relay stations, yeah.
Yes, yes. I was actually the manager of one of them in the Caribbean for a time, in Antigua. And besides Antigua, we had a relay station in Singapore. It had previously been in Malaysia and moved to Singapore. And there was also a station which was run actually for a while by the Diplomatic Wireless Service on Madeira Island, which was off Oman. And there was also, they operated a station in Cyprus. For the BBC, but eventually, in fact, we managed those ourselves.
Now, these were all transmitters that had been set up some time ago, presumably, perhaps during the war even, or even before the war.
Yes, Daventry was set up, I think it was 1932, and that was where the first shortwave broadcasts by the BBC started from. And then during the war, Skelton in Cumbria, Wooferton in Shropshire, and Rampisham in Dorset also opened.
Now, was the technology changing very much, or were these transmitters perfectly good enough, 30 years after they'd been put in?
They started to refurbish these transmitters in the 1960s, first of all, but it came on later than that. The big problem that arose with a lot of this older equipment, and it applied to the medium wave radio stations that were used to broadcast the domestic programs. Of course, the manufacturers, in some cases, they had disappeared, but they'd moved on, so they weren't making a lot of the parts. And at Daventry Transmitting Station, they had a workshop, and these were really clever technicians, and they would actually manufacture parts that the BBC could no longer buy. So they kept the service going that way. Now, through the war and afterwards, every transmitting station was staffed. Everything was manually operated, all switched on and off, and you relied upon the local staff to do all of that. And then the BBC, in the late 1940s, began to experiment with operating transmitters on an unattended basis by using automation. Huge technical developments taking place at that time, and they built a network of low power medium wave stations to improve the service in areas that weren't very well served by the large transmitting stations like Brookman's Park and Moorside Edge. They were unattended. They were designed to be without staff, and they were maintained by a small group of people, these transmitter maintenance teams, and they would go around these stations, in fact, checking them and doing any maintenance, and also visiting them if there were any faults. And they were monitored remotely, it was quite crudely, by a telephone system. But it all worked, and of course the staff savings were huge. And when television began, there was a real need. There were going to be well over 1,000 of these television transmitting stations. And so from the outset, they began to look at the possibility of operating them on an unattended basis. The large transmitters like Crystal Palace and Wenvo, they were all operated, they still had staff, but there was a huge number, hundreds of them, of small transmitters that operated without any staff attendance. And these transmitter maintenance teams, there were 3 to start with. They were increased to 6 in the early 1960s to take account of the new television transmitters. And that's when I joined, as these maintenance teams moved from 3 to 6. I joined the one at Crystal Palace.
Now, how dangerous was it being in the vicinity of some of this kit if it was transmitting at full power?
You kept away, you didn't touch anything, actually. So the safety aspect was very important. But the radiation problem, I mean, there's a huge amount of work, studies done on radiation. And of course, at one time, transmitters were thought to be possibly dangerous. And the studies were carried out. And they found that, no, these particular frequencies that were used at transmitting stations were not harmful. They also examined the records of staff who'd worked at BBC transmission stations, and they found that they were amongst the healthiest of all departments in the BBC.
Getting all that exercise climbing up in the open air, yes, quite. Okay. How much of the ordinary BBC, in quotes, did you manage to get to visit? I mean, you presumably went up to town occasionally, did you, to meet your colleagues?
Yes, the transmission headquarters was based in London, and we were called up from time to time, particularly when we were on the maintenance teams, and also the engineers in charge of the transmitting stations would come up to London, and there would be sort of conferences and meetings. And ideas would be exchanged. So, and of course, there was quite a lot of movement between transmitting stations. It was quite a family organization. I mean, most people knew other people at other places. There were some members of staff who stayed all their career at the one place, and then there were others like me that kept being moved about.
You had to think about where you were going to live, presumably. So if you had a family, this would moving around would be quite a business. BBC helped all that, did it?
There was a very good system of paying allowances when you first you moved, and obviously you were separated from your family, and they would contribute to the house moving costs, the solicitors' costs, and that. So yes, all that was very helpful.
Yes.
The big problem, though, was where you moved to, and I moved in and out of London, and each time we moved back into London, of course, the house price, or the London area,
Yes.
I mean, the house prices were very different. This was a problem, particularly for transmission, who wanted people to move in and out of head office from the transmitting stations. And of course, people who lived in nice parts of the country where property was relatively cheap and they had a very good standard of living were not keen to move into London. And that was one of the reasons why we moved the London transmission headquarters out of London up to Warwick. The Director General had this idea of moving transmission headquarters from London to Hertfordshire. I happened to meet him and he said, "What do you think about this?" And I said, not a good idea. I said, I'm all in favour of moving out of London, but we need to move further away. And he said, "Well, where to?" I said, "Well, somewhere around in the Midlands." And he lit up because he was a Brummie. And he said, "Well, if you can find somewhere in the Midlands," he said, "go ahead." So I had to go back and tell my boss, the Director of Engineering, and he said, "Well, sunshine, you better get on with it." But we did, actually. We put a little team together, and they found this new build on a technology park at Warwick. And yes, it only took about 2 years, and we moved over 300 people all up to Warwick. And we did a reorganisation at the time, and some of the older people didn't want to come, and we were able to, to deal with that happily. There were no enforced redundancies, and we'd been there a year, and it was a social function, and two of the wives of the engineers came up to me and said it's the best thing that's happened to us. And it solved this problem, actually, of we were then able to move people in and out of head office and to transmitting stations and vice versa,
Yes.
which was not really, it wasn't practical with us being based in London. I looked at the Milton Keynes move from Alexandra Palace, and that wasn't terribly successful, by everybody admitted. The main reason was that the managers stayed in London, and so what
Yes.
we did actually as the management team is we all moved up there, and we moved first into this temporary accommodation. It was offices in a factory in Leamington Spa.
But 300 people in a headquarters, not at the transmitters, it's quite a lot, isn't it?
Well,
So,
in fact, it was more than the headquarters, because it was all of the people who dealt with the capital projects, commissioning and of transmitting stations, and we were still
yeah.
building large numbers
Yes.
of them then. So they were the specialist engineers who ordered, the contracts and actually and managed all of these projects. And again, there was the advantage of being able to move them and the people, exchange them with the people at transmitting stations, which was very helpful.
Are we now talking about the 70s,
No,
80s?
this was
80s, I think.
the end of the 80s.
Right. So if you take the whole of Transmission Group, how many people were you managing?
About 1,300,
Hmm.
1,400.
Yeah, a sizable chunk of the BBC.
Yes, and actually that was a lot smaller than it had been, because there had been this automation program
Yes.
had been in place for a long time, and as well as the new stations being built fully automated, we were automating a lot of the older stations as well. And as people I mean, each time we did this, we had a 5-year plan which we agreed with the trade unions, and it took account of people retiring and other people wanting to move somewhere else. It was handled in a very humane way, I like to think. Certainly different to what I see happening around now. Yes.
Yes. So you worked with Transmission Group, but then moved towards central management. Is that right?
Well, I went into central personnel. I spent about the first 8 or 9 years in transmission, and then I was offered an attachment. I mean, a number of people were, and it was to gain management experience. So I spent 6 months in central personnel, and at the end of the 6 months, they offered me a job there permanently, and I stayed there for 5 or 6 years, and
Was
then
this in London?
this was in London. I was involved with the BBC's job evaluation system, the grading department, and also they had an internal management consultancy group, and I worked with that for a while. And I also spent a year on a sort of a secondment to McKinsey's during their major management consultancy review of the BBC, late 1960s. Yes, it was a major review of the BBC. What I was involved in is at the time the BBC was moving from black and white to colour, and they found these colour mobile control rooms that did the outside broadcast were costing 3 to 4 times as much as the old black and white version.
Hmm.
So McKinsey's did this study to determine how many we really needed. And I was a part of a small group working for one of the McKinsey consultants that we looked at this. It took us about a year. Very interesting. But this is where the politics of the BBC came in. We were lobbied, particularly by Manchester and Birmingham, who were fighting for the most colour. They had the most black and white mobile control rooms, and they
And they
were.
desperately wanted colour.
Oh, they wanted colour, and they wanted more than the other lot.
Mm.
But it was really interesting analysing the usage of, and then also talking to producers about the future usage of what they would actually require. Um, and Wales weren't happy because they had to share with the west of England. Scotland were okay. They were sufficiently isolated from the other regions to be sort of self-contained, and so they were quite happy. We had no problem with Scotland, but poor old Northern Ireland really dipped out. I mean,
Yes.
they couldn't justify one at all, and by that time the troubles were sort of beginning. So yes, it was. I felt really sorry for them, but there was quite a dust-up between the west of England and Wales. But the biggest one was definitely the North and the Midlands. All McKinsey could do, as any consultant does, is to recommend. And they said, well, in fact, I had to do the presentation in the end. I mean, there was somebody that was far more qualified to do it, but they made me do it. So I took all the brickbats. The recommendations were there, and of course, we had to justify why we'd made these recommendations.
Yes.
And then it was, of course, up to the television service to decide whether they would accept the recommendations or not. I mean, interestingly, they did for a time, but quite quickly Wales got its own unit and the west of England had kept the one it had previously shared.
But was this largely the capital costs of supplying the equipment, or was it the running costs?
I was talking about, yes, the capital costs. I
Yes.
think there were a few more staff costs, but I don't think there were a lot more. I think most of it was the capital costs.
But this is the time when the BBC's colour licence revenue was increasing very fast, and it was fairly well off at this time. I'm surprised it was worried about the cost of setting up colour equipment, which was, after all, producing the income.
Well, I suppose it hadn't been looked at for a long time. Maybe it was at McKinsey's suggestion. I don't know. But maybe, yes, they said, well, we ought to look at it. It's very expensive. Perhaps we don't need as many as we've already got. I don't know about that. No.
So you were in personnel and you were in London. How did you feel the culture of the BBC was in London?
I was quite surprised, actually. With the central personnel directorate, the people were extraordinarily nice, and they were happy to train me, and there were lots of people I could go and ask questions.
Yeah.
So yes, I was happy there. I enjoyed it. The work was very interesting. We had annual reviews, and I think after about 5 years, I was called in for mine. And now, whether they were fed up with me, I wanted to get rid of me, I don't know, or whether it was genuinely, you ought to move on. But it was suggested that I ought to go back to engineering, and I had probably learned as much as I was going to from them, and I ought to move back to engineering. So I think the message was, we don't see you as staying here forever. What they did do is they brought in people from the BBC to supplement people with consultancy and management experience from outside. And so there were a few people like me who stayed there for a while, but some people stayed on more or less for the rest of their careers. So I thought, well, I better apply for jobs.
Did you find, I mean, McKinsey's come in for a lot of criticism, you bring in the management consultants, they don't understand anything about broadcasting, and they, tell people what to do. How did you find them?
I was impressed with it was a Canadian chap that we worked for, and of course the team, we had a statistician. We had a chap, in fact, who was an engineering manager from outside broadcasts, and we had a producer from outside broadcasts, and then there was me. So
I see.
that come from the BBC's internal consultancy group. So there was plenty of expertise there, and this man that we work for certainly made use of that expertise. And each stage of the study, he would sit us all together and he would question us. And I mean, it was really forensic. He was very, very thorough. So yes, I was impressed with them, and I was impressed with the whole study. Can I just say this about the consultancy experience? I was astonished at the difference in different departments and amongst different managers in the BBC. Some were ultra efficient. You couldn't find that they'd spent a penny unnecessarily. and there were others at the complete opposite end of the scale. And all were thriving within the BBC. And I said, I asked the McKinsey consultant, I said, I'm amazed by this. He said, no, you shouldn't be. He said, this is absolutely normal in any organisation I've ever been to. He said, be it public or private. He said, you will get these huge, huge variations. And he said, the advantage really of using an external consultancy from time to time is that you flush it out. But I mean, I did find radio producers who hadn't produced a program in 3 or 4 years, and they were still on the payroll.
Really?
Unbelievable.
Probably doing research. That's probably what they
Well,
say.
yes. But yes, some departments, I mean, they were just mind-bogglingly, brilliantly efficient.
Now, were you working direct to the director of engineering?
I did work directly to Bryce McCrierick briefly before he retired, and then to a chap called Bill Denney who
Oh, yes.
replaced him. But all of them were amazingly approachable people. You know, they would chat away to you, ask how you were, and they were interested, obviously, in what you were doing. But I found that with all of the managers, even the people on the who had program backgrounds or administrative backgrounds, the people in central personnel and the World Service, Northern Ireland, the top people, in fact, had an incredible interest and actually a surprising amount of knowledge about engineering. I would end up with long conversations with them about what we were doing and what we might do. And it was curious, the difference. The last couple of years I was in the BBC began to bring people in from outside. This was in the John Bert era.
Yes.
And there was a striking difference there. They had no real interest in what had happened or the product. It was management by statistics, and you were producing lots and lots of statistics for them, and obviously the financial side, and that's
Yes.
how it was managed. And
Yeah.
of course, that's happened right across the board now, isn't it? It's
Yes.
yes. I think it was a retrograde step actually. I
Ah,
didn't.
well, it's the big question, isn't it? As to did John
Yes.
Burt save the BBC or ruin it?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, you spent a lot of time, or some time, abroad.
Yes.
How did that work?
Well, of course, being in transmission in the World Service, we had transmitting stations and premises abroad, and so I visited a lot of places as a result of that. And we had contracts we used transmitters with other broadcasters around the world. Lesotho in southern Africa, Berlin was another example. So I would have to go to these places, in fact. I mean, would look at the state of the equipment and make sure we were still happy with it. And when contracts were being renewed as well, I would go.
Yes.
I also visited relay stations from time to time. There was a problem occurred with the manager of the Caribbean Relay Company in Antigua. Now, the Caribbean Relay Company was a joint venture between the BBC and the German broadcaster Deutsche Welle. They shared the costs and the management of the station. The BBC provided the company manager, and Deutsche Welle provided the assistant manager. And we both provided expatriate staff, and we had recruited a lot of local staff in Antigua, and they were trained up to do the job. The idea is eventually there would be very few expatriates there. It would all be run, the majority of the staff would be local. So what had happened is there was a problem, and the manager had to come out at very, very short notice. I was asked if I would go for a month while they made a permanent appointment. I was there for the best part of a year. This happened to me a few times. It happened to me when I went to Northern Ireland. They said, would I go 3 months? There was a vacancy unexpectedly. Would I go for 3 months? And 3 years later, I left. And there were previous incidents of the same sort of thing. I think what happened actually, I was regarded like a footballer as one of these utility players who they could fit in, to a position.
Yes.
When they were short or somebody was injured. Oh well, yes, he'll go and fit in there. So I suppose I wasn't an expert at anything really, just a jack of all trades. But I'm not complaining, because what it did is it meant I had a really very interesting time.
Yes,
Lots of
right.
different experiences and living in
Yes.
lots of different places, and I thoroughly enjoyed that actually. Unfortunately, I'd married a lady who went along went along with it.
Yes, I was going to say, how did the BBC look after you when you had to move for quite a long time? You could take your family with you, could you? And
Well,
they
I didn't.
provided accommodation.
Because of the uncertain nature of the job in Antigua, I mean, thinking I was just going for a short time, and also the children were doing O levels and coming up to O levels, so I couldn't move them.
Ah,
So there was a long separation. They did come out to Antigua for a long summer holiday, and the two children loved it. And then, of course, when I went to Northern Ireland again, they were getting to A level stage, but also, I mean, they'd been brought up mostly in the south of England, um, and they would have been totally lost in Northern Ireland.
yes.
And
Were,
for children, to outsiders to go there, it would have
yeah.
been extraordinarily difficult. So yes, it was 3 years away from the family. I was able to get back for most weekends, and because there was a major project going on in Belfast the whole time I was there, the studios were being completely
Hmm.
refurbished. There were
Yes.
lots of midweek meetings and instead of going straight back to Belfast, I mean, I would wait till the morning and catch a flight from Gatwick early morning. So, yes, it worked out.
Yeah.
I mean, my wife was sort of concerned because the troubles were
The troubles, yes. Weren't the IRA blowing up transmitters and things like that?
they did blow up a transmitter. I think there was army equipment on some of these transmitters, and what they were intending to do is to catch the army on site, because they shared the mast. And what happened is the army were delayed that morning, and the first people to come were the BBC staff, and they got blown up.
Oh,
Two,
really?
yes, two engineers and from transmission, and a local contractor. Very sad. Yes.
Is that while you were there?
No, that happened before I was there. Yes.
Right. Hmm.
Before I went to Northern Ireland, the job I had in transmission head office was I was then managing these transmitter maintenance teams. When I was on them, there were 6, and by the time I was managing them, were 30. So it shows you the way the automation program
Yes.
had
Yes.
had progressed. So I was familiar, and I was probably had the necessary security clearance. You don't know about that, but I probably had,
Yeah.
and so yes, I was asked to go for 3 months, and I
Mhm.
stayed for all that time.
Towards the end of your career, things were presumably changing. We were beginning to get, I don't know when you left the BBC, but presumably,
1995.
I see. So
Yes.
digits and things like that were beginning to appear, were they? The digitization of
Yes.
of the system.
There was a small amount of digital technology used on sound throughout the BBC for quite some time, but no, I was essentially an analog man, and
Hmm.
this was beginning to change as I came up to retirement, and so yes, I am now hopelessly out of date. Because when I retired, that was it. I said, no, I've loved it. I'm not going to
Yes.
be an engineer anymore, and
Right.
I went off and did something different.
Right. Worst moments, best moments?
I suppose the move to Warwick, in fact, was yes, that was the best moment because it did go extraordinarily well. There were a few jobs that we man engineering jobs that we used to pride ourselves in completing them on time and within budget, and I was pleased about that. I think the worst moment was the telephone installation in Broadcasting House, and this was towards the end of my career. What had happened is the BBC had a group of engineers who installed and managed the BBC's internal telephone system right across the BBC. And the BBC employed its own telephone operators. Now, this group of engineers were coming up towards retirement. We were finding that it was difficult to recruit. There were more lucrative jobs coming up in the outside world. And a similar thing with the telephone operators. So this small group of engineers came up with the idea of contracting the service out. And at the time, there were a number of organizations who would come in, they'd completely remodernize your system, they would operate it for you, provide the telephone operators, and it was actually cheaper than us doing it ourselves in-house. I mean, the BBC had grown up doing everything in-house.
Yes.
Because when it started, there was nothing outside. It had to do it. And of course, that tradition had continued on. I mean, I'm talking about the early 90s now, 1990s.
Yes.
And so they came up with this system, and they found a contractor, and they started in the regions, and they did television centre, and it was wonderful. Everything worked a treat. And they came to Broadcasting House. There was just Broadcasting House and Bush House left. And we were all ready, all installed, and we were ready, in fact, to do the big switchover, which we did at a weekend when there were less people about. Now, the project manager from this external organization, I won't mention the name, had a fault. It's a computerized, computer-based system, all digitally controlled. And he found a fault. He couldn't fix it. And he decided to go ahead over the weekend, didn't tell us, went ahead. Monday morning, the staff in Broadcasting House found that they thought they were ringing a particular extension and it was calling somebody else and vice versa. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the calls this was happening to were on the 6th floor of Broadcasting House, the management suite. And within 10 minutes, I had a phone call from the chairman, Marmaduke Hussey. I didn't know him that well, but he always called me by my Christian name. It started, Gallen, what the hell's happening? Come to my office immediately. And over I went. And he was a big chap, Marmaduke Hussey. And my gosh, he threatened me. I was really aggressive. I was trying to explain what had happened. He said, well, you get that project manager and get him sacked, or you're sacked this afternoon. Now,
good Lord.
Really? I'd never had anything like this in the BBC before. So I came back. Fortunately, the engineers that work for me on this job were really brilliant people. And they managed to sort it out. They got on to the contractor, and they sent somebody over. And yes, by the end of the day, they'd sorted it out. And so I contacted the chairman, and he started calling me Bert again. So, but it was just an awful experience. We were all totally nonplussed. And then this project manager admitted that he knew there was a fault. We never saw him again, so I presume that was it, yes.
You could hardly switch back to the old telephone system, presumably.
Oh, no, it's all ripped out, you see.
Exactly,
yes. But afterwards, everybody said, yes, it had worked very, very well. So.
Yeah. Now, that wasn't the end of your career, although it could have been nearly.
Yes.
How did you end up in the BBC?
What happened actually, when John Bert became Director General, there was a major reorganisation of the sort of what they call resources in the BBC, and he decided to bring them all together into this large directorate, and there was no engineering directorate. Engineering would be part of this new resources directorate. My job was Chief Engineer Transmission, and they'd begun to add bits onto it, like engineering research, and then engineering computer services. And then when it became resources, they added the architects department onto it as well. and they decided that I couldn't be called Chief Engineer Transmission anymore. It had to be Chief Engineer Resources. So I didn't like that new title, but I was stuck with it. And we had a new man came in from British Airways as the Director of Resources. Yes, he had a completely different approach to the traditional managers that I'd worked for. But what happened is John Bert interviewed with the new chap, and also with Bill Denny, the outgoing Director of Engineering. And John Bert called each of us in who were going to head up these new parts of resources. And he said, now, I want to know exactly what you're doing, what work is outstanding. And I'd been warned of it beforehand. So I had a list of all of the projects that we were doing. And he said to me, right now, when will you finish these? And I said, well, they'll all be finished in 2 years. And he said, how long before you retire? I said, 3 years. Right, he said. Now, that's definite, is it? I said, yes. Because I knew they were going to privatize transmission. I'd argued against this for about 3 years, saying it would cost more, and this was an important part of the BBC. But John Bert said to me, yes, it will cost more, but in the future, this won't be the only outlet for BBC programs. There will be a huge, because of digital technology, we will have huge options for transmitting our programs. This terrestrial transmission will be just one of them, and I don't see that being part of the BBC in the future. We want to be in a position where we can choose. So yes, it will cost more initially, but the long term, this is the future. Now, I have to say, I didn't see that, and my former boss, who I have great respect for, great engineer, Bill Denny, when I told he'd retired, and I told him this, and he said, no, neither of us saw this coming. But of course, John Bert's vision was absolutely right.
Yes.
I listen to and watch television off satellite, off the internet. I mean, it's just incredible.
Of course.
I didn't agree by any means with lots of things he did, but by Jove, he had the vision to see that.
Yes.
So transmission, I had retired. We did complete all of the projects inside the time, and so I went during that, what would have been my last. I retired inside my last 12 months, and sometime later, the BBC's transmission operation was privatised.
Privatised, yes.
I wasn't part of it.
Well, you got out just in time by the sound of it.
Yes, I did.
And had a good pension at the end of it. Anyway, Bert, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I hope it's interesting.
I think that was very interesting, yes. Thanks very much.